Mideast Realities, a unique half-hour highlighting the real Middle East. It is a program of information that government and media often misrepresent or just don't want you to know. Get the news without bias. Facts without distortion. And most importantly, analysis from the experts. With your host and chairman of the Committee on the Middle East, Mark Brzezinski. Each week, this program will feature an interview, discussion, or an event to help viewers understand the complex situation in today's Middle East, and especially the realities of U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world. Mideast Realities.
But nevertheless, 60 Israelis get killed, and the President of the United States pays a visit, and there's an international conference, and $100 million is given more to the Israelis. Where was the President of the United States saying something compassionately for the Palestinians who have suffered, for the Palestinians who have been killed in far greater numbers than 60? I mean, tens of thousands of Palestinian women and children have been killed just in the years I've been going back, and that's the most conservative number I can pick that I can use. All right, I promised you I wouldn't go on and on, so I'm going to stop. But this is a chance really to ask just honest, provocative questions. We don't need any formalities. You don't have to. I'm just a person like you who's been able to go places and see things that you haven't been able to go and see, and who not that long ago sat in classrooms just like you're doing. So I hope you'll ask away.
I have a question, though I'm not a student. I have heard that Hamas was really financed by the Israeli Mossad. Is that a fact or not?
Yes, it is, because when Hamas was started, the divide and rule strategy was being applied. The PLO was strong. The PLO had money. The PLO had international following. And the purpose was to divide Palestinian society. So here were these Islamic guys who were a counter to the PLO and didn't like the PLO's policies. So the Israelis encouraged them at a time when they were not threatening to the Israelis, but they were threatening to the PLO. So, for instance, here's what Noam Chomsky has to say about the peace process, and about Arafat, and about Hamas. He says, by 1993, Arafat was on the verge of being thrown out. The hatred and contempt for the PLO was extreme on the West Bank in those years. Now, this is just a few years ago. It wasn't this way a decade ago. I remember that myself from wandering. He says, I remember that the hatred for the PLO was extreme from wandering around West Bank villages. People were saying, it's true, that's all we got, but they're really a bunch of corrupt jerks and we need to get rid of them. By 1993, this was reaching a real flood, and there were open calls for throwing out Arafat and his clique of gangsters. At that point, apparently he realized, and certainly the Israelis realized, that this would be a good time to make an agreement with the PLO, the shadow of its former self, because now, to save a fragment of his former authority and power, he'll be our agent, kind of like the local Indian mercenaries who ran India, who ran that place. You would know about that, probably. Or kind of like the Salvadoran military. So the Israelis, when the PLO was strong, they encouraged Hamas, and they also encouraged other secular collaborators. Now that the PLO is weak, and Hamas is strong, they're building up Arafat to attack Hamas. And they'll continue to do that as long as the Americans allow them to do that, because they can't do it if they don't have the support and money and arms of the United States, which is, of course, another reason we should all be particularly concerned about this. Now, surely some students have questions. Surely. Have we got a shy group?
Or maybe a shocked group.
A shocked group?
Yes, I mean, of course, I don't think they would ever believe anything like this could be done by the government. But it is. I mean, it's very hard for anybody to believe that government can be that evil. And the American government has been very evil in many instances.
Ask the Cambodians, or the Vietnamese, or the Thai Hill people, or the Kurds, or the Armenians,
or the
Salvador, or the Chileans.
I mean, the CIA blew up a whole building full of families with children to get one person. They were given the information by their Israeli friends, and that one person wasn't there. They killed the whole building, and they didn't get their person.
Well, if you want to be shocked, take the Gulf War recently. Over 1 million Iraqis have been killed in a country of only less than 20 million people. So realize what we're talking about. 1 out of 20 people has been killed. Do I have the population right? I think I have it. Now, we were told Saddam Hussein's this terrible guy who invaded Kuwait, and we're saving the world for democracy, and off we go with our...
Excuse me, Saddam Hussein is a terrible person for his own country.
So is Hafez Assad. Yes. So is the King of Saudi Arabia.
Well,
so is the Emir of...
I don't know about that, but I know more about these two. I know about my president. I mean, my ex-president. He is a terrible person.
Yes, and he was also our ally.
Exactly. But who installed them there? That's what the people here should know.
Well, worse than that.
They were not installed by themselves.
Not only that, who divided Kuwait from Iraq in the first place? The British. There was no Kuwait. There was a fishing village. The British went into the desert one day, drew some lines on a map.
The geography of the Middle East has been changed and rechanged.
My point is that Kuwait is the 19th province of Iraq. The only reason it is not part of Iraq is because the United States and the British before the United States will not allow it any longer to be part. And why? Because they wanted to weaken Iraq and further divide the region. But this quote, let me read you this quote, which is from Pierre Salinger. Who's Pierre Salinger? He's hardly a radical. Frankly, I don't consider myself a radical. I went to all the right universities. I just went too many places after that and saw too many things. Here's a man who was White House press secretary. Here's a man who was ABC bureau chief in Paris during the Iraq War. And here's what he has to say. And just before I read this, I'll mention another man. How many of you have heard of Ramsey Clark? Here's a man who has prosecuted the United States for war crimes. He's actually brought jurists from all over the world to New York and held sessions where thousands of people attended, and he acted as prosecutor against the United States for war crimes in the Middle East. Sounds like a terribly radical, crazy person. He was Attorney General of the United States, the top legal enforcement person of the United States. His father was on the Supreme Court of the United States. He was in Washington in the LBJ administration. He resigned because of the Vietnam War. And then he went to New York to practice law, and he no longer is a politician. He's no longer having to say and do what other people want him to say and do. He's free to speak his own mind. How many of you have heard either of Ramsey Clark or the fact that he has prosecuted the United States for war crimes and for killing hundreds of thousands, and I'm being conservative, of Arabs? And here's what Pierre Salinger has to say. The Gulf War was the most interesting piece of reporting that I did because it came out with a story that the press didn't tell the American people. That the Gulf War was absolutely unnecessary. I mean, it was a plot. George Bush decided he wanted a war, and George Bush decided to tell Saddam Hussein to go ahead and invade Kuwait. The interesting thing about all this is that there's a book that has been published in this country, except that not even 1% of the Americans even know that the book exists. And what's more interesting, in Europe, the book sold millions of copies. And in the US, it probably has sold about 25,000 copies. But it explains all the things that went on before the Gulf War took place, and explains to what extent it was unnecessary for the war to take place. My point is, if our politicians lie to us, and if our press misinforms us, then what kind of a democracy are we living in? And maybe it's time to reassess what's really going on in this country, and why corporate interests, and why big moneyed interests, and why lobbies. I'll give you another example. This one takes the cake. During the war, the Senate was asked to vote and allow Bush to send troops. He would have sent troops one way or another anyway, but we went through the ritual. However, there was a lot of opposition in the Senate, so they felt they had to really, pump these guys up and make them vote the right way. So what did they do? They brought this woman, and they sat her down in congressional testimony, and she swore to tell the truth. And she said she saw Iraqi soldiers bayoneting children and throwing them out of incubators and taking the incubators back to Iraq, and it was a terrible, horrendous thing, and these people are barbarians. Well, only 6 months after the war did we find out who was this person. She was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington. Nobody bothered to tell us who she was. Worse than that, she wasn't in Kuwait. She was lying through her teeth. She was lying because a public relations firm headed up by the former press secretary of the United States, his name was Jody Powell, and he was Carter's press secretary. He was paid a lot of money to lie to the Congress of the United States, and through the Congress to lie to the American people on the biggest issue of the day, war and peace in the Middle East. And we, Americans, we put up with this. As far as I'm concerned, Jody Powell should be in prison. If what's going to happen in our country is that people are going to come because public relations firms and rich countries hire them, and they're going to raise their hands and lie to us, why go through the charade of pretending that we're a democracy? And if we don't hold them accountable then, and we don't prosecute them for their misleading of the American people, then it's the same thing as with the tobacco executives. If they come and raise their hand one after the other and tell us that tobacco is not addicting, and they all know tobacco is addicting, then the charade of American democracy and the belief in our institutions and the corruption of our public officials and the corruption of our political process has reached a point that we're not all that different than other countries around the world that are ruled by thugs and gangsters. I'm not saying our presidents are thugs and gangsters. What I'm saying is that the faith in our institutions is terribly, terribly undermined, and we all become skeptical, we all become disbelieving, and many of us become cynical, and we go about our lives, and until things blow up around us, and until our own lives are affected, we throw up our hands in disgust and say, what the Arabs say, alhamdulillah.
Now that we've established that sin is not universal, and that America is not as democratic as we once thought, with the implication being that most Middle East countries are, which I don't quite follow. But
no. Why would that be the implication?
Well, I've only heard this argument over here that sin is within the exclusive domain of the United States and American foreign policy.
I don't think I said that, but you may have interpreted that.
It's been implied for the last 20 minutes. But let's just return to some of the factual issues concerning the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, because I don't know if everybody here is really knowledgeable on the facts. Hamas, of these Hamas bombings began with the peace process, because it was viewed as not viewed as accommodation but as appeasement. Is that what I hear you saying? That is Hamas? The bombings have been provoked because they see it as a sellout. It's appeasement. It's not accommodation.
Yeah.
And that's why we've seen an increase in the bombings.
They see that their occupation is continuing and that they're being even more repressed, and this is their way of fighting.
Yeah. How deeply rooted is that belief among the Palestinian masses?
Very deep. Very deep. That's the only way they can survive. How do you think an underground movement like this, with the Israeli army searching for them, with the Palestinian police searching for them, with everybody searching for them, how can it survive?
Yeah. Well, we seem to be led to believe that this is a minority group within the Palestinian masses that support Hamas. None of the Palestinian elites support Hamas or whatever. But you're saying otherwise. You're saying
well, it's not very popular to come out and say I support terrorism and I'm a terrorist. Usually, I mean, when the Israelis were fighting the British,
Yeah.
The Haganah was blowing up British headquarters, blowing up the King David Hotel, and Ben Gurion was saying, we're opposed to this, it's not our policy, but they benefited from it.
But the PLO is seen as being in charge, being supportive. The elections were a landslide.
The elections were rigged.
Well, we understand that. I'm talking about the perception we have. You're saying our perception is wrong. The PLO is actually not that well supported. Support is not that deep, and that most of the Palestinians are not supporting what we call the peace process with Israel.
Most Palestinians, in my view, if you could get them in a place where they felt safe and could really say what they think, would say what Chomsky thinks.
Okay.
They're thugs and mercenaries, and Arafat's a sellout and a collaborator, and Edward Said has outlined it very well.
What would appease Hamas if they were in power?
I'm not here to speak for Hamas, but I'll tell you what I think would stop the terror bombings and would create a viable situation that could be supported by reasonable people of all stripes. Why doesn't Shimon Peres get up and say, we acknowledge the Palestinian right to independence, we acknowledge the Palestinian right to statehood, we acknowledge the Palestinian rights to the same freedoms and the same dignity that we Israelis enjoy. We're working toward that. The end goal of that process is, in fact, sovereign Palestinian state. It'll take some years to accomplish. There are all kinds of problems associated with it. Where is such a statement? Just the opposite. I'll give you quotes where Shimon Peres tells people in private, we really screwed the Palestinians at Oslo. They'll never get a Palestinian state now.
Do you think the existence of any Jewish football team would appease the Arab ultras? Do you honestly believe that?
The implication of your question is that I'm saying things I don't honestly believe, so I can't accept the implication of your
I
question.
was just asking for your opinion.
There's radicals on both sides.
But it seems like the radicals in Israel are a lot smaller in number.
Whew! When's the last time you've been to Israel? The Israelis have assassinated their prime minister. So far, the Palestinian quote-unquote president remains alive, although I believe actually the policy of Israel is to use Arafat and to milk Arafat for everything they can get out of him, and then I believe they would like to see him assassinated by Hamas.
But I think the perception among the Israelis and the government is that the Palestinians do not necessarily agree when Hamas uses bombings.
That's the correct perception among the Israelis.
Well, and that's, if we take it to an international level or comparative level, when the IRA kills people, tens of thousands of Irish turn out to grieve and protest. But in the Arab world, when that happens, there's no such massive outpouring of grief. And
why should you?
And so that helps shapes people. I'm just saying that helps shapes Westerners and particularly Americans' view of.
Do you grieve when Palestinians are killed?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I've seen very few expressions in this country of grieving. In fact, what I have seen is the American Army intervening to help the death and misery. I've seen the American Army off the coast of Lebanon shelling the hills of Beirut. I've never seen an American politician grieve when hundreds or thousands of Palestinians are killed. So let's have some equality here.
Well, didn't the Americans help facilitate the movement of the PLO out of Beirut?
For their own goals, exactly. The PLO was destroyed. They wanted to make Lebanon into an appendage of Israel. They tried very hard to install a pro-Israeli government in Lebanon. Didn't work. He got blown up, probably by the Syrians. That little part of history is all forgotten. Terrorism.
Not by the people.
Okay, agreed.
When in one day the Israeli planes killed 25,000 women, children, and old people in one day on Beirut for no reason at all. No reason. Lebanon did not, especially Beirut. There was no resistance in Beirut.
And now we're paying the price because you see, you can't grieve for 60 Israelis in 1996, if you didn't grieve for 30,000 women and children in Palestinian refugee camps in 1982. That may seem like a big spread of time if you're a college student. In the history of the Middle East, it's just a flick of the eye.
Well,
so there's very little credibility.
My son was getting married and I couldn't go to the wedding. I remember it very well.
Yes. So people who are oppressed fight. The tactics that they use Would I think it better that they blow up an Israeli military camp? Yeah, I think that's probably a far better strategy. However, if you have no guns, if you have the only thing you have are primitive weapons and your own life to give, and you believe in your cause, you use tactics of that kind. And in fairness to those who do suffer and die, it seems those tactics to a certain extent work because they seem to be the only things that get the rest of us to talk about it, and the only things that get the rest. If we were more giving of our emotions and our concern, maybe they wouldn't have to use those tactics. But anyway, I didn't mean to avoid the question you asked. Even if Shimon Peres got up and said, we acknowledge your rights and we believe you're entitled to an independent state, would that convince every single Palestinian that there should be a Jewish state? The answer is obviously no. Would it, in my judgment, convince the great majority of them that they should wait out the process and see if Peres is lying to them, as so many Israeli leaders have before, or if in fact a new leaf has been turned? I believe the great majority of Palestinians would then no longer support terrorism and would wait at least a few years to see what the result would be. However, they know what the reality is. The reality is that the Israelis have lied to them for more than a generation. Ben Gurion promised them, we're not here to set up a Jewish state, we're not here to kick you out. 10 years after all those lies, what did they do? They turned around, created a Jewish state, pushed out as many Palestinians as possible, and massacred villages on purpose. I mean, talk about Deir Yassin. We're not talking about a military action. We're talking about an unarmed Palestinian village that had cooperated with the Haganah, in which the Irgun, which later became the government of Israel, purposely massacred the entire village, then took them to Jerusalem, marched them through the streets of Jerusalem to parade that this village had been destroyed, and then took the survivors back to the village and massacred them some more. So, ethnic cleansing has been happening before Bosnia. Now we've got to get some. I realize that students haven't been there, and maybe you don't even have Middle East courses here. I'm not sure, but at least are these views, as this woman said, shocking to you, or are they just views you didn't expect to hear expressed vocally in public?
I think they're a lot different than what we used to hearing. Can I clarify something that you said earlier? You said that these groups are using violence to try to get people to talk about the issue. Is that right?
They're using violence because without it, a process is going forward in which their rights and their lands and their resources are being stripped from them, and they are powerless to stop it. And since we won't stop it, we, the United States of America, in fact, we're the primary advocate of what is called the peace process by the politicians. But I can give you a list of quotes here from every expert, not from every expert, that's quite an exaggeration, but from Israeli experts, from American experts, even from the keynote speaker at the Middle East Institute this year, which is the bowels of the American political establishment, all saying that the agreements are terrible and lousy and not going to work, not going to lead to a just peace, that it's all a temporary fix, and that the Palestinians are being shafted. Well, it's easy for us to sit in nice classrooms and, we spend an hour talking about it. These people live it every day of their lives.
Well, if the goal is to get them to talk, how does that tie in with your argument that the United States government is promoting a conflict?
Because who gives Israel the money and the guns to occupy them?
But if you're saying that the United States government wants conflict, and these groups are using violence as a way to try and talk and end conflict, how does that tie in?
Well, I believe the United States government and Israel both want a low level of manageable conflict. They don't want to see a revolution. They don't want to see Egypt overthrown, the government of Egypt, but they want a manageable level of conflict, because that level of conflict allows them to play one leader off against another. It allows them to keep American military forces in the region. It allows them to get the kings and the dictators and the monarchs of the region to buy American arms, and it allows us to make deals under the table, economic, CIA, intelligence. It makes those who rule the region need us. And we want everybody there to need us. And the Israelis want one Arab group to be fighting another. My God, the worst thing in the world for Israel would be another Nasser movement, another Pan-Arab movement, another popular uprising in the Arab world that combined the resources of the region against them. Then they'd be in bad shape. Then they'd have to resort to nuclear weapons. And by the way, how would you feel as an Arab if you were living as an Arab with proud history, and you have 20-some countries and 200 million some people, but the only country in the region that's allowed to have weapons of mass destruction is Israel? Something's wrong here. 4 million Jews get to have an arsenal of nuclear weapons, and 200 million Arabs are told that if they develop nuclear weapons, the Americans are going to cut them off or undermine their government or stop sending them aid, which we don't send very much anymore anyway. So, if you're an Arab living under these conditions, what if you were an Arab student at Cairo University and someone was explaining to you that Israel gets to have nuclear weapons, Israel gets $3.5 billion a year, we Arabs are not allowed to develop these weapons, we're not allowed to have democracy, we're not allowed to have free press. How would you feel about living under those conditions? You might put on a headscarf, even if you're not religious, and you might say, well, at least I'm going to remember my heritage, and at least I'm going to use a symbol that they can't force me to take off because it is a religious symbol. And even though I don't really believe all